Hey there, and welcome to Dark Creaky TV. If you're new, hit that subscribe button for spine-tingling Reddit creepypasta stories that are perfect for a night of chilling thrills. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and let's get into tonight's stories. I'll be the first to admit that I've done some dumb things in my life. But what happened with the Ouija board was on a whole different level. We all thought it was going to be just some innocent fun, maybe even a little spooky, but no one expected what we were about to stumble into. I'm still trying to make sense of it, and to be honest, I'm not sure I ever will. It started like any other Saturday night. A group of us, me, Jess, Rob, and Anna, were hanging out at Rob's place, bored out of our minds. It was one of those nights where nothing on Netflix seemed interesting, and we were all too restless to just sit around and talk. That's when Jess pulled out an old Ouija board from Rob's closet. "Dude, I didn't even know you had one of these," Rob said, eyeing the dusty box like it had suddenly come to life. "Found it at a garage sale last week," Jess replied with a smirk. "Thought we could use it for nights like this." Now, I'm not superstitious, but something about that board gave me a weird feeling right from the start. It wasn't one of those cheap-looking plastic ones. No, this thing looked old, really old. The wood was worn, the letters faded, and the planchette had these strange carvings along the edges that didn't look like they belonged. I figured it was just part of the charm, though. Rob, being the eternal skeptic, rolled his eyes and scoffed. "You seriously believe in this stuff? It's just a game." But Jess was persistent, and eventually we all sat around the coffee table, the Ouija board placed in the center. The lights were dim, and Rob lit a couple of candles, mostly for the atmosphere, but I swear it made the whole thing feel like a scene straight out of a horror movie. We all put our fingers on the planchette, and for the first few minutes, nothing happened. Jess was asking the usual questions. "Is anyone here with us? And can you give us a sign?" But the planchette stayed stubbornly still. Anna laughed nervously, glancing at Rob as if to say, "See, I told you it was nothing." But then it moved. At first I thought one of them was messing with us. The planchette slid slowly to the word "yes," and we all exchanged looks. "Who did that?" Anna asked, her voice a little shaky. "No one," Jess replied, her eyes wide. "I swear I didn't move it." "Right," Rob said, but even he looked a bit uneasy. We kept going, the questions getting more specific. "Who are you? How did you die? What do you want?" Each time the planchette moved, spelling out cryptic answers. Some of it didn't make sense, just random letters, but then it started spelling out something different. PROJECTINTERSECTION. "What the hell is Project Intersection?" Rob muttered under his breath. "I don't know," Jess whispered, but her hand was trembling on the planchette now. Anna looked around the room like she was waiting for someone to jump out and yell surprise, but no one said a word. The air felt heavy, like the temperature in the room had dropped a few degrees. Rob was the first to speak again. "All right, this is getting weird. Let's ask it something else." He cleared his throat and asked, "What is Project Intersection?" For a few long seconds, nothing happened. The room was dead silent, except for the faint sound of the wind rustling the trees outside. Then, slowly, the planchette began to move again. CIA, I swear, the moment those letters appeared, something shifted in the room. It was like the walls closed in and the shadows seemed darker, heavier. The candles flickered violently, and I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Is this a joke?" Anna asked, her voice barely a whisper. "No one's messing with you," Jess snapped, her face pale. Rob, ever the skeptic, laughed, but it sounded forced. "CIA? Right, because we're talking to some dead government agent. This is ridiculous." But I wasn't so sure anymore. Something about this felt wrong, really wrong. Against my better judgment, I asked, "What is Project Intersection?" The planchette moved faster this time, as if whatever was on the other side was eager to tell us. SEEKCOORDINATES. The words sent a shiver down my spine. Rob grabbed his phone and started typing into Google. Let's see if this is some kind of prank. There's no way this is legit. But nothing came up. No search results, no articles, nothing. It was like the project didn't exist, or if it did, it had been wiped clean from the internet. We all sat there in stunned silence, unsure of what to do next. The air felt heavy, oppressive, like we'd crossed some invisible line. And then it happened. The candles blew out, every single one of them. The room was plunged into darkness, and for a split second, none of us moved. The only sound was the faint creaking of the floorboards and the distant hum of the wind outside. That's when Rob's phone lit up. He held it up to his face, squinting at the screen, and his expression changed from confusion to pure terror. "What is it?" Jess asked, her voice trembling. Rob didn't answer. He just held his phone out for us to see. There, on the screen, was an email. No subject, no sender, just a message. "Stop asking questions." I felt my stomach drop. The words were like a punch to the gut, and I could feel the blood drain from my face. We all stared at each other, frozen in place. There was no way someone could have sent that message. We were sitting right here. No one had touched their phone except Rob. The board, the email, the candles, it was all too much. It didn't make any sense. And that's when I realized we had connected with something real, something that wasn't supposed to be found. Whatever Project Intersection was, we had stumbled into something much bigger than any of us could have imagined. And it wasn't over. After that email, none of us knew what to do. We were all just sitting there in silence, trying to process what had just happened. The air was thick with tension, like we were waiting for something else to go wrong. Jess, usually the bold one in the group, was nervously tapping her fingers against the edge of the table, while Rob stared at his phone as if willing it to explain the impossible. "I don't like this," Anna said, her voice breaking the silence. "This isn't just some dumb game anymore." She was right. This wasn't fun or spooky. It was something else entirely. The word CIA still hung in the air, and the email that had appeared on Rob's phone. There was no way anyone could have sent that. Not without knowing what we were doing, and no one else was in the room but us. Rob, still staring at his phone, cleared his throat. "Look, it's probably some prank. Ouija boards are just a bunch of nonsense. Someone's messing with us, and we're falling for it." "But how?" I asked, keeping my voice steady even though my hands were trembling. "Who would know we were doing this? You didn't post anything, did you?" He shook his head, but the uncertainty was clear in his eyes. I could tell he was trying to convince himself as much as us. Jess, on the other hand, wasn't so sure anymore. She had this look on her face, like she was piecing together a puzzle she didn't like. "What if it's real?" she said, her voice quieter than usual. "What if we really, I don't know, contacted something? What if Project Intersection is an actual thing?" Rob scoffed, but it lacked the usual confidence. "A secret government project talking to us through a Ouija board? Come on, Jess. That's..." "Wait," I interrupted. "The board said something about coordinates, right? It told us to seek coordinates. What if we ask it for those?" The room fell silent again. The idea was insane, I knew that. But we had already stepped into this nightmare. Something had reached out to us, and the only way to figure out what was happening was to keep going. Jess hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Okay, but if this gets any weirder, we stop, for real this time." Reluctantly, we all placed our fingers back on the planchette. I could feel the pulse of fear running through my veins, making my hands feel clammy, but I forced myself to focus. "Where are the coordinates?" I asked aloud, my voice shaky but steady enough to get the words out. For a moment, nothing happened. I thought, maybe we were done. But then, the planchette started moving. Not slow and hesitant like before, but with a firm, almost forceful motion. It slid across the board with a purpose, spelling out a series of numbers. 39.0997 north, 94.5786 west. I grabbed my phone and quickly typed the numbers into Google Maps, my hands trembling the entire time. My heart was pounding in my ears, and I could barely focus on the screen. When the map finally loaded, the location appeared clear as day. Kansas City, I muttered, more to myself than anyone else. Those coordinates are in Kansas City. That's random, Rob said, shaking his head. Why would a secret government project be connected to some random spot in the Midwest? But Jess looked at me, her face pale. It's not random, she whispered. I've seen those numbers before. We all stared at her, confused. My dad used to work for the government, Jess continued, her voice barely above a whisper. He wasn't CIA or anything, but he had some clearance for certain projects. I remember him having a map with those exact coordinates pinned on it when I was a kid. I never asked him about it because, why would I? But now I'm wondering if it's connected. Anna swallowed hard. Do you think he was part of this Project Intersection? Jess didn't answer. She didn't have to. The look on her face said it all. Before we could say anything else, Rob's phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen and paled instantly. It's another email, he muttered, his voice shaking now. He turned the screen toward us so we could all see. You've gone too far. Leave this alone. Okay, this is getting ridiculous, Rob said, his voice rising in panic. Someone's messing with us. It has to be. They've got to be watching us somehow. No, Jess said, shaking her head. This is bigger than a prank. This is something my dad never talked about. Never. If this is what I think it is, we need to stop. Now. But the truth was, it was already too late. We had asked too many questions, dug too deep. Whatever this project was, we had made contact with it. And now, we were on its radar. I could feel the tension in the room rise, the weight of fear settling in like a thick fog. No one wanted to admit it, but we were in danger. We had connected with something that wasn't just paranormal, but real, powerful, and watching us. We should go to Kansas City, I said, before I even realized what I was suggesting. What? Are you out of your mind? Anna hissed. We just got a warning to stop. I know, I replied, running my hands through my hair. But think about it. If these coordinates are tied to the CIA, to whatever this project is, then maybe we can figure out what's going on. Maybe we can end this. No way, Rob said, shaking his head. This is already bad enough. I'm not getting in deeper. But Jess, her eyes still wide with fear, nodded. I think we need to see what's out there. We didn't know it yet, but whatever we found at those coordinates would change everything. We left for Kansas City the next morning. It wasn't an easy decision, but after the second email, we all knew something bigger was happening. We couldn't just pretend it didn't exist. The air between us was thick with tension, none of us saying much during the drive. The whole thing felt surreal, like we were part of some strange movie plot we didn't sign up for. Jess sat in the passenger seat, quiet, her fingers tapping nervously against her phone screen. Rob was in the back, alternating between grumbling about how we were making a huge mistake and scrolling through conspiracy forums, trying to figure out what Project Intersection could mean. Anna, sitting next to him, stared out the window the entire time, her hands clenched in her lap. No one was excited to be on this trip, but curiosity had wrapped its cold fingers around us, and we couldn't shake it. As we got closer to Kansas City, something strange happened. My phone buzzed with a notification, a message. I glanced down, expecting some random spam text, but my breath caught in my throat when I saw it. They're watching. There was no number attached to it, no name, just those two words. I didn't say anything at first, trying to brush it off as some fluke, but when I looked over at Jess, her face had gone pale. Did you just get a text? She asked. her voice barely a whisper. I nodded slowly, and Rob, overhearing, leaned forward. Me too, he said, holding up his phone. On his screen was the same message. Anna's phone chimed next and she gasped. What is this? None of us had any answers. All we knew was that whoever or whatever was behind Project Intersection was following our every move. But we were already committed. There was no turning back. When we finally arrived at the coordinates, I'll admit, I was expecting something a lot more obvious. You know, like a hidden bunker, an old government facility, maybe even some keep out signs warning us that we were stepping into restricted territory. But what we found was far more unsettling. It was an abandoned warehouse. The place was run down, rust covering the old metal siding, windows cracked or boarded up. We parked a little ways down the road, trying not to be too obvious, and walked the rest of the way in silence. As we approached, the warehouse loomed in front of us, casting long shadows in the afternoon sun. There was something off about the whole scene, something that made my stomach churn. The building felt like it was watching us, waiting. Jess was the first to break the silence. This doesn't make any sense. Why would the CIA be tied to this? None of us had an answer. We circled the building, searching for a way in. Finally, we found a side door, half hidden behind some overgrown weeds. The door creaked loudly as we pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty space like a scream. The inside was even more unsettling than the outside. The air was thick with dust, and broken machinery was scattered around the room. It looked like no one had set foot inside in years. But there was something else. As we ventured deeper into the warehouse, we found a small unmarked door near the back. Unlike everything else in the building, it looked newer, like it had been replaced recently. Jess knelt down, running her fingers along the edge of the door frame. This wasn't here when the place shut down, she muttered. Someone's been here. Rob shifted uneasily behind us. I don't like this, guys. We need to get out of here before he could finish, Jess pushed the door open. What we saw on the other side changed everything. It wasn't a room. It was a staircase leading deep underground. The steps were old and narrow, the walls lined with faint, flickering lights. There was no way this was part of the original warehouse. This was something else, something hidden. Without speaking, we all started down the stairs, the air growing colder with every step. The deeper we went, the more it felt like the world above was slipping away, like we were descending into some forgotten place that wasn't meant to be found. At the bottom of the stairs, we found a long, narrow hallway, the walls made of cold, grey concrete. There were no windows, no doors, just a single steel door at the end of the hall. My heart was racing, my palms slick with sweat as we approached the door. Jess reached for the handle, hesitating for just a moment before pulling it open. The room inside was small, cramped, and filled with old filing cabinets and dusty equipment. But what caught our attention was the table in the center. On it was a stack of folders, each marked with the words Project Intersection in bold black letters. We didn't have time to process what we had found. As Jess reached for the nearest folder, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway behind us. I spun around, heart pounding, as the shadows stretched across the walls. Someone or something was coming. We need to leave. Now, Rob hissed, his eyes wide with panic. But Jess wasn't listening. She was already flipping through the folder, her face pale as she read the contents. "Oh my God," she whispered. "This isn't just a project. It's an experiment." Before we could ask her what she meant, the footsteps grew louder, closer. There was no time to think. We grabbed as many folders as we could carry and bolted for the stairs, our footsteps echoing in the narrow hallway. My heart was racing, my lungs burning as we ran. Whatever was following us, it wasn't far behind. We reached the top of the stairs just as the door behind us slammed shut with a deafening crash. I didn't dare look back. We ran out of the warehouse, my chest heaving with every breath, and scrambled into the car. As we sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw someone standing in the doorway of the warehouse watching us. But when I looked again, the figure was gone. We didn't stop driving until we were well outside of Kansas City, our hearts still racing, hands shaking as if the fear hadn't quite let go of us yet. It wasn't until we reached a dingy motel, hours later, that we finally pulled off the road. No one said much during the drive. The weight of what we had seen, or rather, what we had nearly been caught in, sitting heavy on all of us. Once inside the motel room, Jess threw the stack of folders on the bed and sat down, her face still pale from the experience. Rob locked the door behind us and double-checked the windows like we were being hunted. And honestly, it felt like we were. "What the hell were those footsteps?" Anna finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Whoever it was, they weren't happy we were down there," Rob muttered, pacing the room. "I'm telling you, we shouldn't have gone. We should have just left this whole thing alone." Jess ignored him. She was already rifling through the folders, her eyes scanning page after page. "No, we had to go," she said, her voice firm but uneasy. "We're in too deep now. Whatever this is, it's bigger than we thought." I sat down next to her and pulled one of the folders closer, my hands still trembling as I opened it. The documents inside were old, yellowed with time, but the words on the pages were still clear. They were government files, stamped with all the usual warnings, top secret, classified. But what caught my attention was the name, Project Intersection. "What is this?" I muttered to myself, flipping through the pages. Each document was stranger than the last. They talked about experiments, psychological tests, mind control, even something about remote viewing, whatever that meant. But it wasn't just normal government research. It felt wrong, like these experiments had crossed a line. As Jess skimmed through another folder, her face went pale. This isn't just some government project. This was a CIA experiment. They were trying to make people weapons. I blinked at her. "Weapons? What do you mean?" She held up a document, her hand shaking slightly as she passed it to me. "They were using people, testing on them. See this? They wanted to create people who could see things without being there. Like they could project their minds into other places, spy on enemies without ever leaving a room." Rob snatched the folder from my hands, his eyes widening as he read the words for himself. "You mean like psychic soldiers?" "It sounds ridiculous," Jess said, shaking her head. "But look at the dates. This isn't just some conspiracy theory. This was real. These experiments were going on for decades." I stared down at the papers, feeling a chill run through me. The idea that the government had been doing something like this, using people for experiments. It made my skin crawl. But as I kept reading, something else caught my attention. There was a list of names, subjects. I scanned the list, my heart pounding faster with each name I read. Most of them didn't mean anything to me, just strangers who had probably been forgotten. But one name stopped me cold. Jess's last name. I looked up at her, my throat tightening. "Jess, I think your dad was involved in this." Her eyes flicked to the page I was holding, and for a moment she didn't say anything. She just stared at it, her face pale, her mouth slightly open as if the words were caught in her throat. That's not possible," she finally whispered. "He never talked about this. He would have told me." But deep down, I think she knew. The way her dad never discussed his work, the strange files he had kept hidden away, it all lined up. He hadn't been just some government employee. He had been part of this Project Intersection. "Maybe he didn't want you to know," Rob said quietly. "Maybe it was too dangerous." I watched as Jess clenched her fists, her face a mix of fear and anger. She flipped through the remaining pages, her eyes scanning for any other clues. And then, just as she reached the end of the folder, she found something that stopped her cold. A photograph. It was an old, grainy picture of a group of men standing in front of what looked like a military facility. Most of the faces were unrecognizable, blurry from age, but one face was clear. A man standing near the back, looking serious, with a stern expression. It was Jess's father. "Oh my God," she whispered, her hands shaking as she held the photo. He was involved. He was part of this whole thing. The air in the room felt heavy, like the walls were closing in. Jess's dad had been part of something we weren't supposed to know about, something dangerous. And now, we had uncovered it. There was no going back from this. Before we could say anything else, Jess's phone buzzed. She glanced down, her face going white as she read the message. "You shouldn't have come here." It was the same message we had all gotten before. The same threat. But now, it felt more real than ever. Suddenly, Rob's phone rang. He answered it, but after a few seconds, his face twisted in confusion. "There's no one there, just static." He hung up, but the phone rang again almost immediately. The sound pierced through the room like a siren, and this time, we didn't answer. Something was happening, something we couldn't see, but we could feel it creeping closer. I stood up, pacing the room. "They know we're here. They know we have these files." "We have to destroy them," Anna said, her voice shaky. "We can't keep these. They're coming after us." But Jess shook her head, her grip tightening on the folders. "Number. We need to keep them. This is proof. Whatever they did to my dad, whatever Project Intersection was, we need to expose it." Before we could argue, there was a loud knock on the door. We all froze, the sound echoing through the room like a gunshot. My heart stopped for a second and I glanced at Rob, whose eyes were wide with panic. No one moved. Another knock, louder this time. Then, from behind the door, a voice, low, cold, and eerily calm. "You have something that doesn't belong to you." The knock came again, harder this time, rattling the flimsy motel door in its frame. Whoever, or whatever, was on the other side wasn't going to wait much longer. My pulse was hammering in my ears, and every instinct screamed at me to run. But where could we go? We were trapped. Jess gripped the folders tighter, her knuckles white. "We can't let them take this," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but the urgency in her words was clear. "If they get their hands on these files, everything dies with them." Rob shot her a panicked look. "What the hell are we supposed to do? There's no way out." The knocking stopped. Silence fell over the room, thick and heavy. For a moment, I thought maybe whoever it was had left. Maybe we had a chance. But then, we heard it. The sound of a key sliding into the door's lock. My heart sank. They were coming in, whether we liked it or not. Jess frantically shoved the folders into her backpack, her hands moving faster than I thought possible. "We need to hide these," she hissed. "They can't know we've seen this." I grabbed the bag from her, throwing it under the bed just as the door began to creak open. The cold air from the hallway rushed in, sending a chill through the room. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My mind was spinning, a whirlwind of fear and adrenaline. And then, they stepped inside. Two men, dressed in black suits, their faces unreadable. They didn't look like the kind of people you'd mess with. There was something off about them, something too controlled, too cold. They didn't speak right away, just stood there, their eyes scanning the room like they were taking mental notes. The taller one, his face blank and expressionless, took a step forward. "We know what you have," he said, his voice low and calm. "Hand it over, and no one has to get hurt." Jess swallowed hard, stepping in front of the bed, trying to shield the backpack with her body. "We don't have anything," she said, her voice trembling but defiant. "You're making a mistake." The man didn't blink. "We know you've seen the files. That information is classified. You're not authorized to have it." I could feel the tension in the room building like a rubber band stretched too tight, ready to snap at any moment. My hands were shaking, but I tried to keep my voice steady. Look, we didn't ask for this. We stumbled onto something we didn't understand, but we're not criminals. Just leave us alone. The second man, shorter but somehow more intimidating, took a step closer. His eyes locked onto Jess. You don't understand what you found. You think this is about your father? It's bigger than that. Project Intersection was never meant to see the light of day. And if you think we'll let it slip into the wrong hands, you're gravely mistaken. Jess didn't back down. What did you do to him? She demanded, her voice rising. What was he part of? He never told me anything, and now I know why. You ruined him, didn't you? You used him. The tall man's expression didn't change. Your father knew what he was getting into. He made a choice. Jess's face twisted with anger, but before she could respond, Rob stepped forward, his voice shaking. This is insane. You can't just erase what we've seen. People will notice we're gone if something happens. We'll tell everyone. The shorter man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. No, you won't. The atmosphere in the room shifted. The men weren't here to negotiate. They were here to clean up a mess. We were the mess. I could feel panic rising in my throat. I didn't want to die in a dingy motel room, all because we got too curious. My mind raced, searching for a way out, and then I saw it. Just a glimmer of hope. The window. It wasn't locked. I could slip it open, maybe distract them long enough for Jess and the others to make a run for it. It was a long shot, but it was all I had. I edged closer to the window, my movements slow, hoping they wouldn't notice. Rob caught my eye, and I gave him the slightest nod, praying he'd understand. His eyes widened, but he didn't say anything. The men were still focused on Jess, who was standing her ground like a shield. They didn't see me reach for the window latch. In one fluid motion, I yanked the window open, the cool night air rushing in. Go! I shouted, grabbing the backpack from under the bed and tossing it to Jess. Run! Chaos erupted. Jess bolted for the door, clutching the bag, while Rob and Anna scrambled after her. The men lunged forward, but I kicked the nightstand into their path, buying us precious seconds. My heart was in my throat as I followed the others out the door, sprinting across the motel parking lot as fast as my legs would carry me. Behind us, I could hear the men shouting, their footsteps pounding on the pavement. We didn't stop. We couldn't. We reached the car, breathless and panicked. Jess fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking so badly she could barely get the door unlocked. Finally, we piled in, slamming the doors shut just as the men emerged from the shadows, their eyes locked onto us. Go! 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 Rob yelled, his voice frantic. Jess floored the gas, and the car screeched out of the parking lot, the men shrinking into the distance behind us. My heart was still racing, my mind struggling to catch up with what had just happened. We drove in silence for what felt like hours, none of us daring to speak. Finally, Jess pulled off the road, parking in an empty lot far from the motel. We sat there, catching our breath, trying to process what we had just survived. The files were still in the backpack, hidden beneath the seat. They were our only proof of what we had found, but as the adrenaline faded, a new realization crept over me. This wasn't over. The men in black suits, they wouldn't stop. They wouldn't let us go, not now that we knew about Project Intersection. They were watching, following, waiting for the moment when we'd slip up. We need to disappear, Jess whispered, breaking the silence. We need to get these files to someone who can expose them. We need to end this. None of us argued. We had stumbled onto something dark, something buried deep in the shadows of government secrets. And now, the weight of it was on our shoulders. As we drove off into the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how far we ran, they would always be there, watching, waiting. Project Intersection wasn't over, and neither was the nightmare we had just stepped into. Okay, so I've never been one to believe in paranormal stuff. Ghosts? Nah. Spirits? Not really my thing. But what happened to me and my friends, I still can't explain it. This isn't one of those over-the-top stories where things jump out of the shadows or people vanish into thin air. No, this is worse. Much worse. It started on one of those lazy weekend nights. You know, when you're bored and the only thing to do is hang out with friends and see what trouble you can get into. My buddies and I, Tom, Megan and Jess, were at my place. We'd been binge-watching horror movies, laughing at how fake they all seemed. But Tom, always the one looking for something cool to do, pulled out this dusty old Ouija board he'd found at a garage sale. "Let's give it a shot," Tom said, grinning like he was 5 steps ahead of the rest of us. "What's the worst that could happen?" I groaned. "Seriously? You believe in that stuff?" "No, but come on. It's just a game." Tom shrugged. Jess was already rolling her eyes, but Megan, who always had a fascination with weird, spooky stuff, seemed curious. Before I could protest, Tom was setting it up, lighting a few candles for ambience. The lights were dim, and despite not believing in any of it, I was starting to feel a bit uneasy. We sat around the board, our fingers lightly resting on the planchette. Tom, as usual, took the lead. "Is there anyone here with us?" Nothing. The planchette didn't budge. We all exchanged glances, smirking at how dumb this seemed. Tom pressed on. "Is anyone watching us?" I don't know why he chose that question. Maybe it was because we'd just watched some low-budget horror movie about a stalker, but something about the silence that followed his question felt wrong. Thick, like the air in the room had shifted. Then, ever so slightly, the planchette began to move. I laughed nervously, assuming Tom was pulling a prank. But his face was dead serious, his fingers barely pressing down. Megan and Jess exchanged looks, both of them wide-eyed. The planchette spelled out a word. W-R-T-C-H. "Watch?" Jess asked, her voice sounding smaller than usual. "That's creepy." "Someone's watching us," Megan whispered, looking around the room, as if she expected to see someone hiding behind the curtains. I was about to joke about the whole thing, chalking it up to one of us pushing the planchette, but then it moved again. This time faster, as if whoever, or whatever, was controlling it was in a rush. C-A-M-E-R-A-S, cameras. My stomach dropped, and the room suddenly felt too small. My apartment was basic, nothing fancy, but the thought of hidden cameras, it felt too real, too close. "That's not funny," I said, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease. "Who's messing with this?" Tom raised his hands, looking just as freaked out as the rest of us. "It's not me." I swear the planchette continued to move, sliding back to spell one last word. R-U-N. None of us said a word for a long moment. The candle flames flickered in the dim room, casting shadows that felt too alive. I could feel my heart beating in my throat, the adrenaline kicking in. Tom broke the silence, trying to laugh it off, but his voice shook. "Okay, I think we've had enough of that," he said, standing up and flipping on the lights. The brightness was a relief, but it didn't make the tension go away. We all agreed to put the board away and call it a night. The mood had shifted from fun to something darker. Megan was the first to leave, muttering something about how creepy it all was, while Jess and Tom stayed behind for a bit, making awkward small talk. But soon, they left too. I was alone in my apartment, the stillness settling in again. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying the word cameras over and over. It didn't make sense. Why would a Ouija board tell us we were being watched? More importantly, how could it? It's just a stupid game, right? But as I tossed and turned, I started noticing things. Little things. Like how the streetlight outside my window seemed dimmer than usual, how the shadows in the corners of my room seemed darker, denser. I convinced myself I was just paranoid from the Ouija session. Then, the worst thing happened. At around 2 a.m., I heard a faint click. The sound was so soft that I almost ignored it. But it happened again, this time louder. I sat up, my heart pounding. The sound was coming from my living room. Slowly, I got out of bed, grabbing my phone for light. As I stepped out of my room, everything felt wrong. The air was heavy, thick with tension. And then I saw it. In the corner of the room near my TV, there was a small red light blinking. My heart sank. I'd never noticed it before. It was subtle, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. A camera. A tiny, almost invisible camera pointed directly at where we had been sitting earlier. I froze. How long had it been there? Who put it there? A million questions raced through my mind, but I had no answers. I reached for it, my hand shaking, and plucked it from its hiding spot. It was small, no bigger than a button, and definitely not something I had installed. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like my entire life had been on display without me even knowing it. Shaking, I called Tom, Megan, and Jess. No one picked up. I didn't know what to do, didn't know if I should call the cops or throw the camera out the window. All I knew was that the board had warned us, and it was right. Someone was watching us, but I had no idea how much worse it was going to get. The next morning, I didn't go back to sleep. How could I? My apartment didn't feel like my apartment anymore. Knowing there was a camera there, watching me, had flipped a switch in my head. I didn't feel safe. I barely ate breakfast, just sitting in my kitchen, staring at the tiny camera I'd found the night before. Who put it there? And why? Tom was the first one to call me back. His voice sounded groggy, like he had just woken up. "What's up, man? You called like 6 times. "I found a camera in my apartment," I blurted out, unable to hold back. There was a pause. "What? Like a camera? Dude, are you messing with me?" "No, Tom. It was in my living room, just sitting there, hidden behind the TV. I think it's been recording us. Maybe for a while." For a second, I thought Tom would laugh, say I was being paranoid. But when he spoke again, his voice was quiet. "You're serious?" "I don't know what to do. I thought maybe it was a prank, but I didn't put it there. And I'm sure you didn't either." "I didn't. That's messed up." He let out a long sigh. "I'll come over later, all right? We'll figure it out." It was around noon when Tom showed up. We didn't waste time with small talk. I showed him the camera, and he stared at it like it was a bomb about to go off. "Where did you say you found this?" "Behind the TV." He didn't respond. Instead, he walked over to the TV, crouched down, and started checking the walls, the furniture, anywhere someone might have hidden more cameras. Every minute that passed, I felt more and more on edge, like I was waiting for someone to burst through the door. "You think we should call the cops?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I wasn't sure why I was whispering, but it felt like the walls had ears. Tom hesitated, standing up and glancing at the camera in my hand. "I don't know, man. What if this is some, surveillance thing? Maybe it's not even aimed at you. Maybe the previous tenant had enemies." I wanted to believe that, but deep down I couldn't. Something about it didn't add up. "It doesn't make sense. The Ouija board, Tom. It said we were being watched." Tom's face twitched, and he rubbed the back of his neck like he was trying to shake off the thought. "Come on, dude. The Ouija board? That's just coincidence. We probably freaked ourselves out with that. I mean, it's not like some ghost is planting cameras in your house." I wanted to agree, but the knot in my stomach wouldn't let me. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Megan. "We need to talk." Now I called her immediately. "What's up, Megan?" She didn't even let me finish. "There was a camera in my apartment too." My blood went cold. "What? Where?" "I found it this morning, hidden in my bedroom. The weird part is, I swear it wasn't there before. I would have seen it. But last night, I don't know. I got this feeling, like someone was watching me. And then, boom, camera." I shot a glance at Tom, who was listening to the conversation with wide eyes. Same thing here. I found one too. We were just about to figure out what to do. Have you called Jess? There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Megan? Did you hear me? Have you called Jess? She's not answering her phone. Something about the way she said it, flat, with a hint of worry, sent a chill through me. Jess wasn't the type to ignore calls. She was always glued to her phone. Maybe she's just out, or her phone died. I don't think so, Megan said, her voice tight. I drove by her apartment this morning. Her car's in the driveway. Lights were on. But when I knocked, nothing. I called her like 5 times. No answer. I felt a pit open up in my stomach. All right, we're coming over to her place. Stay there. We'll figure this out. Tom and I rushed out the door, barely speaking as we drove over to Jess's apartment. Every scenario was running through my head, each one worse than the last. Was she hurt? Was someone inside her apartment? Had she found more cameras and freaked out? When we got to her place, Megan was waiting outside, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She's still not answering. I've been knocking, calling, everything. Did you try the door? Tom asked, already heading up the porch steps. Megan shook her head, and together we followed Tom as he tested the doorknob. It was locked, of course. He knocked hard, calling out, Jess! It's Tom, open up. No answer, just the silence of an empty house. Move, I said, stepping up beside Tom and pressing my shoulder into the door. After a few tries, it gave way, the door swinging open into the dimly lit living room. The air inside felt wrong. It was like stepping into a space where time had stopped. Jess's stuff was everywhere, her shoes by the door, her purse on the couch, but she was nowhere to be seen. Jess, I called out, my voice shaky. The 3 of us split up, checking every room. Her bedroom, bathroom, kitchen, all empty. But nothing looked disturbed. It was like she had just vanished. Her bed was made. Her phone was lying on her nightstand, still buzzing from missed calls. The only thing out of place was this unsettling stillness that made my skin crawl. Where the hell is she? Megan muttered, pacing back and forth. Tom was staring at the TV, his face pale. Guys, you might want to see this. I hurried over, my heart pounding as I followed his gaze. On the TV stand, barely visible behind a stack of DVDs, was a small blinking light. Another camera. I felt sick. Whoever was watching us, they had gotten to Jess. But how? Why? We need to get out of here, Megan said, her voice trembling. This is too much. We need to call the police. But before any of us could move, there was a sound, a faint clicking noise, like the turning of a lock. We all froze, staring at each other, our eyes wide. Then, slowly, the front door creaked open behind us. We spun around, but the doorway was empty. No one was there. The door swung shut with a soft thud, as if someone had just slipped out. Jess! Megan called, her voice shaking. But no one answered. We rushed to the door, throwing it open and running outside. But there was no sign of anyone. The street was empty. Quiet. Eerily normal, like nothing had happened. Except something had. Jess was gone, and whoever or whatever was watching us was making their move. I didn't know what to do next, but I knew one thing for sure. The cameras weren't just watching us, they were controlling us, and we had no idea what was coming next. We didn't stick around Jess's apartment after that. Something about the door opening on its own. It didn't feel like coincidence. It felt planned, deliberate, like someone was toying with us. None of us wanted to admit it, but we all felt it. Whoever had planted those cameras wasn't just watching, they were playing with us. And Jess, she was missing, completely gone. Tom drove us back to my place, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. No one said a word during the drive. Megan sat in the back, her eyes darting nervously out the window, like she was expecting someone to jump out of the shadows at any second. I kept looking down at my phone, waiting for Jess to call, to text, anything. But the screen stayed dark. When we got back to my apartment, the three of us sat around my kitchen table in silence. The weight of everything hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Megan broke the silence first. "Do you think Jess is okay?" Her voice was small, almost like she didn't want to hear the answer. Tom looked up, his eyes hollow. "I don't know. None of this makes sense. Who puts cameras in people's homes and just, what? Watches? This is insane." "We should have called the cops back at her place," Megan said, running a hand through her hair. "What if something's really happened to her?" I nodded, but in my gut, I knew the police wouldn't be able to help us. This wasn't something they could fix. This wasn't a break-in or some stalker situation. It was deeper than that, and as much as I didn't want to admit it, it all traced back to that damn Ouija board. Whatever had come through that night, it wasn't done with us yet. Before I could speak, my phone buzzed. I practically jumped out of my chair, snatching it off the table. The caller ID was blank, just a string of numbers I didn't recognize. Megan and Tom watched as I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the answer button. "What if it's Jess?" Megan whispered. I pressed answer and brought the phone to my ear. "Hello?" For a moment, there was nothing, just static. Then, a faint, distorted voice crackled through the line. It was almost too soft to hear, but I caught enough to make my blood run cold. "They're watching. Don't speak." I froze. The voice was low, mechanical, like it was being run through some kind of filter. My mouth went dry as I glanced at Tom and Megan, who were watching me intently. I didn't dare speak. The voice continued, a little clearer now. "You've all been marked. Silence is the only way. Don't speak. Don't look." I didn't know what to say. The words twisted in my mind, making no sense, but at the same time, they sent a shiver down my spine. Marked? By who? And why silence? The static crackled again, and then the line went dead. I stared at the phone in my hand, my thoughts racing. Tom leaned forward. "Who was it?" I don't know," I muttered, still processing the words. "They said we've been marked, and that we shouldn't speak or look." "Speak or look at what?" Megan asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know." The voice was distorted, like they didn't want me to recognize them. It felt like, I don't know, like a warning. Tom rubbed his face, frustration clear in his voice. "This is all messed up. Cameras, people disappearing, creepy phone calls. What the hell is happening to us?" I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that the cameras were just the start. Whatever had marked us, whatever had warned me not to speak, it was getting closer. I could feel it, creeping in around us like a dark cloud. Later that evening, after Megan had gone home and Tom had crashed on my couch, I sat in my room, staring at my phone. I had gone over the events of the last few days again and again, trying to piece it all together. But every time I hit a wall, the cameras, Jess's disappearance, the cryptic phone call, it was all connected, but I couldn't see how. At around midnight, I heard it again, that faint clicking sound, the same one from the night I found the camera. I bolted upright in bed, my heart hammering in my chest. Slowly, I reached for my phone, turning on the flashlight and sweeping it across the room. Everything looked normal at first, my dresser, my desk, the closed door. But as I scanned the room, the beam of light caught something strange. In the corner, just above my closet, a small red light blinked. Another camera. I felt sick. How many of these things were there? How long had they been watching? I grabbed the nearest object, a book, and hurled it at the camera. It made a dull thud as it hit the wall, knocking the tiny device to the floor. The red light flickered and died. But the sense of relief that washed over me was short-lived, because at that moment, my phone buzzed. Another text. This time it wasn't from an unknown number. It was from Jess. "Don't break the cameras. They're always watching." My hands started to shake. Jess. She was alive, but how did she know? How could she possibly know I had just knocked the camera down? I dialed her number immediately, but the call went straight to voicemail. I tried again. Same result. She wasn't answering, and the more I thought about it, the more terrified I became. Was she the one who had called earlier? The distorted voice? Or was someone else using her phone? I sat there, staring at the screen, feeling completely helpless. My phone buzzed again. Run. That was it. Just one word, but it was enough to get me moving. I grabbed my jacket and woke Tom up, practically dragging him off the couch. We need to go. Now. He didn't argue, just grabbed his things and followed me out the door. The night was cold, the kind of cold that clings to your skin, and every shadow seemed to stretch too long, like they were hiding something. I could feel eyes on me, invisible and all-consuming. The urge to look over my shoulder was unbearable, but I didn't dare. We drove for what felt like hours, not saying a word, just putting as much distance between us and my apartment as possible. The whole time, my phone kept buzzing, but I didn't check the messages. I couldn't. Jess's warning kept repeating in my head. Don't speak. Don't look. When we finally pulled into a motel parking lot, we sat in the car for a moment, neither of us sure what to do next. The silence was suffocating. Finally, Tom spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. What now? I didn't know. All I knew was that the cameras weren't just a way of watching us. They were controlling us. And I was terrified of what would happen if we didn't follow the rules. The motel was the kind of place where everything felt off. The dim lighting in the parking lot, the flickering sign, the way the cold air seemed to cling to us as we hurried inside. We got a room at the far end, away from prying eyes, or so we thought. Tom and I hadn't spoken much since leaving my apartment, and the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Inside the room, Tom dropped his bag onto the bed and rubbed his face, looking as worn out as I felt. So, what now? We can't just keep running forever. I didn't answer right away. My mind was racing with the events of the past few days, Jess's disappearance, the cameras, the warnings, and that phone call. Silence, they'd said. Don't speak. Don't look. But what did that even mean? I sank onto the edge of the bed, my eyes drifting to the motel's small, outdated TV. A chill crept up my spine, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, even here. I turned to Tom, my voice low. What if it's all connected to the Ouija board? What if we opened something we shouldn't have? Tom shook his head. It was a stupid game. We didn't summon anything. This is real. Someone's watching us. It's got nothing to do with ghosts or spirits. It's surveillance. A prank gone too far. But even as he said it, I could see the doubt in his eyes. Before I could reply, my phone buzzed again. I'd lost count of how many texts I'd ignored since we left my apartment. But this time, I checked. The message was from Jess again. You need to leave. They're here. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt my throat tighten. I showed the message to Tom, and his face went pale. Here, he asked, his voice barely a whisper. How could they know? The moment he said it, the silence of the room felt heavier, suffocating. The small, cheap lamp on the bedside table flickered once, then twice, and then darkness. The power cut out, plunging the room into shadow. The only light was the soft glow from my phone screen. I stood up quickly, adrenaline surging through me. We need to go, now. But as I moved toward the door, the knob began to rattle. Soft at first, like someone was testing it, then more aggressively. Tom backed up, his eyes wide. What the hell? I froze. Whoever, or whatever, was outside wasn't knocking or announcing themselves. They were trying to get in. The rattling stopped for a brief moment, replaced by the sound of heavy, slow footsteps just beyond the door. Then, a soft tapping. Rhythmic, deliberate. It was the same sound I'd heard back at my apartment. The same sound I couldn't explain. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Jess. Don't open the door. Stay silent. I glanced at Tom, who was mouthing something I couldn't make out, but his panic was clear. My phone buzzed a third time, and without thinking, I unlocked it. I said, "Don't speak." I held my breath, panic gripping my chest. I gestured to Tom, pointing to my lips, signaling him to stay quiet. He nodded, though his expression was desperate, pleading. The footsteps outside continued to pace, back and forth, slowly, methodically. Whoever, or whatever it was, they were waiting for something. Waiting for us to slip. Then there was a soft click. I didn't realize I'd done it, but my phone had hit the floor, the sound of it landing on the cheap carpet somehow too loud in the stifling silence. The footsteps outside stopped immediately. I felt the blood drain from my face. Tom stiffened beside me. We didn't move. We didn't breathe. The doorknob began to turn slowly. The door wasn't locked. We hadn't had time to lock it. Tom looked at me, and I could see his panic giving way to desperation. Without thinking, he lunged toward the door, slamming his body against it to hold it shut. The door shook violently as whatever was on the other side pushed back. Tom grunted, struggling to keep it closed. I ran to help him, pressing my weight against the door, my mind racing. Whoever was on the other side was strong, far stronger than any of us. The pressure against the door felt like it could break through at any second. "Hold it!" Tom hissed through gritted teeth, beads of sweat rolling down his forehead. The rattling grew louder, more frantic, as if whoever, or whatever, was getting impatient. The tapping started again, this time louder, more forceful. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the panic rising. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The rattling, the footsteps, the tapping. Silence. A thick, eerie silence that filled the room like a blanket. Tom and I stood there, pressed against the door, breathing hard, waiting for whatever was going to happen next. But there was nothing. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, but must have only been a few minutes. Slowly, Tom released his hold on the door, backing away cautiously. I followed suit, my eyes locked on the door handle, waiting for it to move again. But it didn't. I turned to Tom, my voice barely above a whisper. What just happened? Before he could answer, the lamp flickered back on. The power had returned, but the atmosphere in the room was still thick with tension. We both jumped as my phone buzzed again. I picked it up with trembling hands and checked the message. It wasn't from Jess. "You broke the silence." I stared at the screen, my mind racing. The phone call, the texts, the cameras, they all pointed to the same thing. Some kind of game, a twisted test we were being forced to play. And we had just failed. Tom slumped onto the bed, his face pale. What now? What do they want? I didn't know how to answer, but deep down, I had a feeling we were being punished. The silence had been broken, and now, whatever was outside, whatever had been watching us through those cameras, wasn't going to stop. Then, Tom's phone buzzed. He looked down at the screen, his face going even paler than before. "They sent me something," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I stepped over, glancing at the screen. There was a single image, grainy and distorted like it had been captured from an old security feed. It showed a motel room, our motel room, the one we were standing in. Only it was empty, no sign of us. Just the empty bed, the flickering lamp, the door slightly ajar. The next message appeared on Tom's screen, clear and simple. "Look behind you." We both turned, slowly, every muscle in my body screaming not to, but we couldn't stop ourselves. The door was wide open. And the darkness beyond it wasn't just an empty hallway. Something was standing there. The figure in the doorway was barely more than a shadow, but it was there. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was just standing, watching us. I could feel its presence like a weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. My body went cold, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. Neither could Tom. We were frozen, locked in place by the sheer terror of it. For what felt like an eternity, We stared at the figure, and it stared back. Then, slowly, it took a step forward. The room seemed to shrink as it moved closer. Its form was blurry, shifting, as if it wasn't fully there, like it was something trying to pull itself into our reality. The air grew thick, almost unbreathable. My heart pounded in my ears, each beat louder than the last. Tom finally snapped. "We need to go, now!" He grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the window. I didn't hesitate. Whatever was in the doorway, we couldn't face it. We threw open the window and climbed out, the cold night air hitting us like a slap to the face. The parking lot was empty, eerily still, and the motel lights cast long, unnatural shadows across the asphalt. We ran. No plan, no direction, just running, trying to put as much distance between us and that thing as possible. My lungs burned, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. As we rounded the corner of the motel, Tom skidded to a halt. I slammed into him, nearly knocking us both over. What are you doing?" I gasped, trying to catch my breath. But he wasn't looking at me. His eyes were fixed on something ahead of us. I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop. Cameras, dozens of them. They were everywhere, mounted on poles, on the walls of the motel, even on the nearby buildings. Their red lights blinked in unison, all pointed directly at us. My skin prickled with a horrible realization. We hadn't escaped. We were still being watched, no matter where we went. They had been watching the whole time. What is this?" Tom whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't have an answer. My mind was racing, desperately trying to piece together what was happening. The cameras, the figure, the cryptic messages. It was all connected. But how? And why? Before I could respond, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I hesitated before pulling it out, my hands shaking. Another message from that unknown number. "You can't hide." I looked around, my pulse racing. There was no one else in sight, no movement except the eerie blinking of the cameras. But the message had made it clear. We were trapped, surrounded, and there was no way out. "Tom, we need to keep moving," I urged, pulling at his sleeve. But he didn't move. He was staring at his own phone, his face pale. "They're everywhere," he whispered. "The cameras. They're everywhere." I shook him, trying to snap him out of it. "Tom, snap out of it. We have to go." But it was too late. The red lights on the cameras blinked faster, more frantically, as if they were responding to us, tracking our every movement. I felt the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes bearing down on me, watching, waiting for us to make the wrong move. Then, the same tapping sound from before echoed across the parking lot. It was distant, but unmistakable, like someone knocking on glass. My heart sank as I realized it wasn't just a sound. It was a signal. "They're coming," I whispered. Tom looked at me, his face filled with fear. "Who's coming?" I didn't have time to answer. A figure appeared at the far end of the parking lot, emerging from the shadows. It was the same thing we had seen in the doorway, tall, distorted, its form shifting unnaturally in the dim light. And it wasn't alone. More figures stepped into view, their movements slow and deliberate, each one identical to the last. They moved as one, a mass of shadows creeping toward us, closing the distance with terrifying speed. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Tom's arm and pulling him with me. We sprinted toward the street, the sound of our footsteps echoing through the empty night. My lungs burned, but I pushed harder, the terror of what was behind us driving me forward. But no matter how fast we ran, the tapping followed us. Soft at first, then louder, closer, like a drumbeat of inevitability. The streetlights ahead of us flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the ground. The figures were gaining on us, their presence warping the world around them. The air grew colder with each passing second, the oppressive weight of their approach pressing down on my chest. We reached the street, But there was nowhere to go. The buildings around us were dark, silent, their windows like empty eyes staring down at us. The tapping grew louder, relentless, as the figures closed in. Tom stumbled, falling to his knees in the middle of the road. I can't keep running," he gasped, his breath ragged. I turned back, grabbing him by the shoulders. We can't let them catch us." But he shook his head, tears in his eyes. It's too late, they've already won. The figures were only feet away now, their forms shifting and twisting like shadows in a storm. I could feel their cold presence creeping closer, the air around us thickening with the weight of their approach. And then the tapping stopped. Everything went silent. The world seemed to freeze in that moment, the air still, the shadows motionless. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest, waiting for whatever was going to happen next. Then, one of the figures stepped forward. It was the closest one, its form towering over us, its face, or what should have been a face, nothing more than a void. Slowly it raised a hand, pointing directly at me. A single, distorted voice echoed through the silence. "You broke the rules." Before I could react, the figure lunged forward, its shadow enveloping me, cold and suffocating. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The darkness swallowed me whole, pulling me into an endless void of silence and emptiness. And then, just as suddenly, it was over. I woke up in my apartment. The sun was shining through the window, casting warm light across the room. Everything was normal. No cameras, no shadows, no tapping. But Tom was gone. Jess was gone. And deep down, I knew they weren't coming back. I grabbed my phone, scrolling through my messages. No texts from Jess, no cryptic warnings. Nothing. It was as if the last few days had never happened. But when I looked up, I saw it. In the corner of my living room, almost hidden, a tiny red light blinked. They were still watching, and they always would be. So, I've never been one to believe in the paranormal. I always chalked it up to people getting carried away with their imaginations. I guess you could say I was a skeptic, always brushing off ghost stories or anything that felt supernatural. That is, until a few weeks ago. I've been hesitant to share this because honestly, I'm not sure what's happening or how to fix it. But here I am, hoping someone can shed some light. It started on a Friday night when my friends and I decided to hang out at my apartment. We were just your average group, Joe, David and Kelly, the kind of people who'd rather spend a night in with snacks, a few drinks, and a terrible horror movie than hit the club. David's a bit of a wild card. He always has these random ideas that are either really fun or borderline insane. That night, he brought something to the table that I initially thought was going to be in the dumb fun category. A Ouija board. Seriously. I laughed when he pulled it out of his backpack like it was some kind of treasure. A Ouija board? Dude, we're not 13. But David had this grin on his face, the one that said, "Trust me, this is going to be good." And in typical David fashion, he egged us on until we caved. We dimmed the lights, set up the board on the coffee table, and placed our fingers on the planchette, expecting nothing. To be honest, I didn't even feel a flicker of fear at first. It felt like we were about to play an old-fashioned board game. David was the one who started asking questions, the usual ones. Is there anyone here with us? And what's your name? And of course, nothing happened. We were all laughing, blaming each other for pushing the planchette when it would jerk slightly. It was all fun and games until Joe, joking around, said, "Let's ask about the dark web." Now, a little context. Earlier in the evening, we had been talking about all the creepy things you hear about the dark web, stories of hitmen for hire, illegal auctions, and government secrets. None of us had ever actually gone on the dark web, but the idea of it fascinated us in that same morbid way people slow down to watch a car crash. David, being David, immediately jumped on Joe's suggestion. He asked, what can you tell us about the dark web? The air in the room shifted. I don't know how to explain it, but suddenly everything felt heavy. I thought it was just my imagination, but Kelly's eyes went wide, and she sat up a little straighter. The laughter stopped, and no one made a joke about pushing the planchette this time. At first, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the planchette began to move. At first, I thought it was David, or maybe even Joe messing around, but the way it glided under our fingers didn't feel like anything we were doing. It spelled out Darknet. David let out a nervous chuckle, but no one joined him. The room was dead silent. My heart was pounding, but I couldn't take my fingers off the planchette. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Joe cleared his throat and asked, "What's on the darknet?" The planchette moved faster this time, almost like it had been waiting for that question. Control. Kelly gasped, and I could feel my own pulse in my throat. Control. What the hell did that even mean? David, in his usual brash style, pushed forward. "Who's in control?" The planchette jerked violently to spell out a single word, ALWAYS. And just like that, the lights in my apartment flickered, and every electronic device in the room shut off. TV, phone, laptop, everything. The room was bathed in the faint light from the street outside, but even that seemed dimmer, as if the darkness was seeping in from all sides. We sat there in stunned silence for what felt like an eternity before David broke it. "It's probably just a power surge, guys," he said, though his voice wavered. I could tell even he didn't believe that. When we tried to turn the devices back on, none of them worked. My phone, fully charged just an hour earlier, was dead. Joe tried the TV and the laptop, but they were both unresponsive. Even the Wi-Fi was down. I felt my stomach drop. We all agreed to stop playing, which was probably the smartest decision we made that night. Kelly was visibly shaken, and David, for once, didn't have a snarky comment. We cleaned up the board and sat in silence, hoping the power would come back on, but it didn't. That was just the beginning. When the power eventually returned, something was off. My phone lit up, but it wouldn't connect to the internet. At first, I thought it was just a Wi-Fi issue, but when I tried using data, the same thing happened. Every website I tried to visit redirected me to the same blank page, no matter what I typed. Joe, David, and Kelly had the same issue. No internet, no apps working, just a blank screen. It was like we had been cut off from the regular internet altogether. That's when the messages started showing up on the blank page. Random, short sentences, like someone or something was trying to communicate with us. I'll never forget the first one. "You asked the wrong questions." We tried to ignore it, but every time we refreshed the page, a new message appeared. "You're being watched. This is only the beginning." We couldn't figure out what was happening, but it became clear that we had stumbled onto something we shouldn't have. The Ouija board, the dark web, the sudden internet blackout, it felt like they were all connected. We had poked at something dark, and now it was poking back. I don't know what's going to happen next, but I'm terrified. It's like we've been locked out of the regular world and pushed into something darker. And the worst part, there's no going back. We've tried everything to reset our connections, but nothing works. We can't escape this digital limbo, and I'm starting to wonder if we'll ever be able to access the real internet again. If anyone has any idea what's happening, please tell me, because I'm starting to think we're not alone anymore. The thing is, after that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, more than just a broken connection or some glitch. It wasn't just about the internet anymore. There was something deeper, something darker happening to us, and none of us knew how to deal with it. The weird messages didn't stop. In fact, they got worse. Every time I tried to open my browser, the same blank screen would pop up with a new, cryptic sentence. They were always short, always chilling, and it wasn't just me. Joe, David, and Kelly were getting the same thing on their devices. No matter where we were or what time of day it was, the messages followed us. One night, after hours of trying to figure out how to fix this, I decided to refresh my browser one more time, half out of desperation, and there it was. Another message, but this one hit different. It didn't feel like some random threat or warning. It felt personal. "We see you." I froze, staring at the screen. There was something so unsettling about the simplicity of it. Who was we? I looked around my apartment feeling exposed, like someone or something was watching me right that second. I closed the laptop, but the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it grew stronger. I texted David immediately. "Are you seeing this?" I typed, my hands shaking. Within seconds, his reply came through. "Yeah, I don't like this man." David wasn't the kind of guy to get scared easily. Seeing him rattle just made everything feel that much worse. Joe and Kelly weren't doing any better. Joe, usually the laid-back guy who laughed off anything spooky, hadn't been able to sleep for days. Kelly, normally the voice of reason, was on edge every time I saw her, like she was constantly looking over her shoulder. It wasn't just paranoia. Weird things started happening, things none of us could explain. One night, Kelly called me in a panic. "My phone's been acting up," she said, her voice shaking. "It won't stop playing this creepy static noise, and no matter what I do, it won't turn off." I could hear the noise in the background, like the hum of a broken radio, distant and distorted. It made my skin crawl just listening to it. I rushed over to her apartment, hoping it was just some bizarre coincidence, maybe her phone glitching out like the rest of our devices. But when I got there, I could feel it. The same heaviness we'd felt when we first used the Ouija board. The air was thick, suffocating almost. Kelly was sitting on her couch, staring blankly at her phone, which was still buzzing with that awful static sound. I grabbed it from her, tried to turn it off, but no matter what I did, the screen stayed frozen, the noise relentless. Then, without warning, the static cut off, and a new message appeared. "You're not safe." I dropped the phone. The message was clear, and it felt like a threat. Not just some random warning. Something was targeting us. Kelly started crying, and I didn't know how to comfort her, because I didn't understand it myself. It was like the digital world had twisted into something more sinister, something that was creeping into our reality. I stayed with Kelly that night, the two of us sitting in silence, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did, at least not physically. But we both felt it, the sensation of being watched, even inside her locked apartment. The next day, David called us to meet up. He said he had something we needed to see. When we arrived at his place, he looked worse than I'd ever seen him. Pale, bags under his eyes, like he hadn't slept in days. He pulled out his laptop and motioned for us to sit. "I don't know how to explain this, but it's like our whole online presence has been erased," David said, running his hands through his hair. "I can't access any of my social media accounts. They're all gone, no trace of them. My email, nothing. It's like I don't exist online anymore." We all checked our phones, our laptops. It was the same for all of us. Facebook, Instagram, emails, everything we had ever used was wiped clean. Gone. Like we had been erased from the internet. "How is that even possible?" Kelly asked, her voice trembling. "Who could do that?" I didn't have an answer, and neither did David. But one thing was clear. Whatever we had triggered with that Ouija board had found a way to trap us. Not just in some digital space, but in a reality where we were no longer in control. Joe, who had been the quietest through all of this, finally spoke up. "Maybe we need to stop thinking this is just about the internet." I looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" Joe hesitated, then said, "What if this is something else? Like, what if it's not just the Ouija board or the dark web? What if whatever we contacted can actually affect us, like, in real life?" It sounded ridiculous, paranormal entities crossing over into our world through the internet. But after everything that had happened, could I really say it was impossible? David nodded slowly. I've been thinking the same thing. Kelly buried her face in her hands. So what do? We're trapped. We can't go back to normal, and we don't even know what's after us. That's when another message appeared on David's laptop, completely unprompted. No one had touched it, and yet the words flashed across the screen, each letter burning into my mind. You should never have asked. We all stared at the screen, hearts pounding in unison. The room seemed to darken, the shadows creeping closer, like something was just waiting to close in. That's when we realized it wasn't just about the Ouija board. Whatever we had contacted, whatever we had disturbed, had taken hold of us. We weren't just being watched anymore, we were being hunted. We tried to return to normal life after that, but things kept getting worse. It wasn't just the messages on our devices or the static-filled noises that randomly blared through our phones. There was something more, something that we could feel lurking just out of sight, always watching. Every night, I found myself double-checking the locks on my doors and windows. No matter how secure I made my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was standing just outside, waiting for the right moment. David called me one night, his voice low, almost frantic. Meet me at the park, now. The park was about a 15-minute walk from my place, and I considered telling him to wait until morning. But there was something in his tone that I couldn't ignore. I grabbed my jacket and left, my heart racing the entire way there. When I got to the park, David was already pacing near the old swings, looking like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes darted around the empty park, scanning the shadows like he expected something to jump out at any moment. I didn't know who else to call, he muttered when I approached. I can't stay at my place anymore. I frowned. Why? What's going on? David looked over his shoulder, his face pale. It's not just the messages, man. I'm seeing things. Every time I look outside my window at night, I swear I see someone standing there, watching me. But when I go outside, there's no one there. I thought it was my imagination, but then it started happening during the day too. Chills ran up my arms. I glanced around the park, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows, but the only sound was the distant rustling of leaves in the wind. Still, the air felt heavy, just like it had that night we messed with the Ouija board. You think it's them? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. David nodded, his expression grim. It has to be. It's like they're everywhere now. I even saw someone standing outside your place last night. I froze. What? Yeah, I was walking by, and I saw this tall figure just staring up at your window. I thought it was a random person at first, but the way they stood there, it wasn't right. They didn't move, not even when I walked past. My heart hammered in my chest. I hadn't noticed anything unusual outside my window, but then again, I'd been too paranoid to even look. David continued, his voice shaky. I've tried everything to stop it. I've turned off all my devices, deleted every app, even got a new phone. But the messages, they still come, and it's not just text anymore. He pulled out his phone and handed it to me. I hesitated before taking it, not sure I wanted to see whatever had him so freaked out. But when I looked at the screen, my stomach dropped. It was a photo of David's apartment, taken from outside. The shot was grainy, like it had been captured by an old camera or a poor quality phone. But what made my blood run cold was the figure standing in the corner of the photo. A shadowy outline, almost too tall to be human, with no distinguishable features, just dark and blurry. And the worst part, it was looking directly at his window. I've gotten 6 of these in the last 2 days, David said, his voice barely a whisper. All from different angles, but always with that same figure. I don't know how they're doing it, but I feel like they're watching me through everything. My phone, my laptop, even my TV. I can't escape it. I handed the phone back to him, trying to suppress the wave of nausea that hit me. This was no longer just an internet problem. Whatever we had contacted had crossed over into the real world, and now it was closing in on us. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside sent my heart racing. I found myself staring at the ceiling, waiting for the next strange noise or the next message on my phone. But the house was dead silent, almost too silent, like the world was holding its breath. Then, at around 3 a.m., my phone buzzed. I grabbed it, half expecting another one of those cryptic messages, but it wasn't that. It was a photo. It was my apartment. I sat up in bed, my hands shaking as I stared at the image. It was just like the one David had shown me, except this time, it was my window in the frame. And there, in the corner of the photo, was that same tall, dark figure. Blurry, faceless, but unmistakably there. I ran to the window, heart pounding, and ripped the curtains aside. But there was nothing. No one. The street was empty. I tried to calm down, telling myself it had to be some kind of elaborate prank. Maybe David was messing with me, or maybe someone had hacked into our phones. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't just some hacker messing with us. It felt ancient, malevolent, like it had been waiting for us to make a mistake. And now it had found a way in. The next morning, I called Joe and Kelly, but neither of them picked up. I texted them, asking if they were okay, but got no response. Hours passed, and still nothing. I was getting more and more anxious, the sense of dread gnawing at me. Then, around noon, David called. His voice was frantic. "Joe and Kelly are gone." "What do you mean, gone?" I asked, my throat dry. "I mean, they're not answering their phones, their apartments are empty, and no one's seen them since yesterday." Panic set in. I knew this wasn't a coincidence. Joe and Kelly hadn't just disappeared, they'd been taken. Or worse. David and I decided to meet up again, this time at my place. When he arrived, he looked worse than before, like he hadn't slept at all. We sat in my living room, both of us on edge, waiting for something to happen. And that's when the knocking started. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder and more insistent. 3 slow, deliberate knocks, followed by silence. David and I exchanged a look, neither of us daring to move. Then the knocks came again. 3 slow, heavy thuds, like someone, or something, was standing just outside my door. I crept toward the door, my heart hammering in my chest. David followed close behind, his hand resting on my shoulder, as if to steady both of us. I opened the door slowly, inch by inch, the creaking hinges echoing through the empty hallway. But when I looked outside, there was no one there. Just the cold, empty street beyond, and the lingering feeling that something was watching us from the shadows. The silence that followed those knocks stretched on, pressing down on us like a weight. David and I stood in my doorway for what felt like an eternity, staring out into the empty street, listening to the quiet. I half expected something to move in the shadows, some figure to reveal itself. But nothing happened. And maybe that was worse, knowing that it was still out there somewhere, watching us, waiting. We closed the door, locked it, then pushed a chair in front of it for good measure. It didn't make me feel any safer. In fact, I felt more exposed than ever. It was clear that no amount of locks or barricades would stop this thing if it really wanted to get to us. David sat on the couch, his leg bouncing with nervous energy. "We need to figure this out, man. We need to do something before..." He trailed off, but I knew what he meant. "Before we disappeared like Joe and Kelly." I nodded, pacing the room. "I know, but what the hell are we supposed to do? We don't even know what we're up against." David rubbed his temples, thinking. "It started with the Ouija board, right? Maybe we need to go back to that. Maybe there's some way to undo whatever we've done." I hesitated. The idea of messing with that thing again sent a wave of unease through me. But what choice did we have? Ignoring it clearly wasn't working, and the longer we waited, the worse things were getting. Joe and Kelly were proof of that. I reluctantly agreed. Fine, we'll try it again. But this time, we don't ask any more stupid questions. David gave a half-hearted laugh. Yeah, no more dark web nonsense. We pulled the Ouija board out from the back of my closet, where I'd stashed it after that first night. The sight of it made my skin crawl. It felt wrong, like it was radiating some kind of dark energy. But we set it up on the coffee table, just like before. The air in the room seemed to thicken as we placed our fingers on the planchette. David's voice was barely a whisper when he spoke. Is anyone there? The planchette didn't move at first, and I almost breathed a sigh of relief. But then slowly, it began to shift under our fingers. My heart raced as it glided over the board, spelling out a single word. Yes. David swallowed hard. Who are you? The planchette jerked to life, moving quickly now, as if it had been waiting for us to ask. It spelled out something that made my blood run cold. We control. I shot a glance at David. Ask it how we stop this. He nodded, his voice shaky. How do we undo what we've done? For a moment, nothing happened. The room felt impossibly still, like even the air had stopped moving. Then, slowly, the planchette began to move again. Cannot. My stomach twisted. David's face went pale. What do you mean, cannot? The planchette spelled out another message, one that sent a chill down my spine. You belong to us now. David pulled his hands back from the board like it had burned him. Screw this, he muttered, standing up and pacing the room. We're not getting any answers from this thing. It's just playing with us. But I couldn't take my eyes off the board. The words it had spelled out echoed in my mind. You belong to us now. I didn't know what that meant, but it didn't sound like something we could just walk away from. That's when my phone buzzed. The sound startled me so much I nearly jumped. I grabbed it off the table, dreading what I might see. Another message. This time not from a number I recognized, but from an unknown source. The screen showed a simple text. You are next. My hands shook as I showed it to David, his face drained of color. We need to get out of here, he whispered, grabbing his jacket. Now. I didn't argue. We bolted out of the apartment, not even bothering to lock the door behind us. It didn't matter where we went, as long as it was away from that place, away from whatever was haunting us. We ended up driving around the city for hours, not saying much. Every time we stopped at a red light or parked in a quiet street, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see that dark figure lurking somewhere behind us. Eventually, we pulled into a gas station, needing to refuel both the car and ourselves. The fluorescent lights inside the station flickered overhead as we grabbed coffee and snacks, trying to act normal, even though nothing felt normal anymore. As we sat in the parking lot, sipping on bad gas station coffee, I noticed something strange. The people around us, they were staring. At first, I thought it was just paranoia, but no, they were definitely watching us. A man standing by the pumps, a woman walking out of the store, they all had this blank expression, like they were observing us. I nudged David. Do you see that? He looked around, his eyes widening. Yeah, what the hell? We quickly got back into the car, but the uneasy feeling lingered. It was as if the whole world had turned its gaze on us, like the people around us weren't people anymore, just extensions of whatever was hunting us. As we drove away, I glanced into the rearview mirror, and that's when I saw it. A figure, standing in the middle of the parking lot, its face hidden in shadow, too tall, too still, watching us as we sped off into the night. Neither of us spoke for the rest of the drive. When we finally reached David's apartment, I half expected to see the figure waiting for us there, but the street was empty. Still, we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed, that no matter where we went, it would find us. David turned to me, his voice quiet, but filled with a cold certainty. It's not just watching anymore. It's everywhere. That night, neither of us slept. The air in David's apartment felt heavy, oppressive, like we were being smothered by some unseen force. Every now and then, I would hear a creak or a faint whisper, and my heart would race. But when I turned on the lights, there was nothing. Just the darkness closing in around us. And then, sometime around 3 a.m., my phone buzzed again. This time, the message was different. It was just one word, but it was enough to freeze the blood in my veins. Run. After that last message, everything changed. The word run echoed in my mind, but we had nowhere to run. We sat there, paralyzed with fear, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the longer we waited, the more unbearable the tension became. It felt like the world was holding its breath, ready to collapse in on us. David stared at his phone, his face pale in the dim light of the apartment. "I don't think we can run," he finally whispered, breaking the silence. "Whatever this is, it's already here." I didn't want to believe him, but deep down, I knew he was right. It didn't matter where we went. This thing, this presence, it was all around us. We couldn't escape it. I checked my phone again, half expecting another message, but the screen was blank. No texts, no calls, just the creeping, suffocating silence. David stood up, pacing nervously across the room, his eyes darting toward the windows as if he expected something to break through at any moment. "What if we confront it?" he asked suddenly, his voice shaky but determined. I blinked, not sure I'd heard him right. "Confront it? How? We don't even know what it is." David turned to me, his eyes wild. "We have to try something. We can't just sit here waiting to disappear like Joe and Kelly. There's got to be a way to stop this." I wanted to argue, to tell him it was pointless, but I couldn't. He was right. We couldn't just wait for whatever was coming. We had to act, even if we didn't know what we were up against. I nodded slowly. "What do you have in mind?" David grabbed the Ouija board from the corner of the room, his hands trembling as he set it on the table between us. I felt a pit form in my stomach just looking at it. The board had started this whole nightmare, and now we were going to use it again. He sat down, motioning for me to join him. "If it wants to communicate, then we'll make it talk. We'll demand answers." I hesitated, but the fear of doing nothing was worse. I sat across from him, both of us placing our fingers on the planchette. The room felt colder, the shadows darker, as if the very air was closing in around us. David was the first to speak, his voice trembling. "What do you want from us?" The planchette didn't move right away. For a moment, I thought maybe this time it wouldn't respond at all. But then it jerked under our fingers, moving slowly but deliberately across the board. "Lives." I swallowed hard. "Lives?" I exchanged a look with David, his face as pale as mine felt. We knew now that whatever this thing was, it wasn't just interested in scaring us. It wanted something far more dangerous. David's voice wavered as he asked the next question. "Why us?" The planchette paused for a long moment before spelling out a word that made my blood run cold. CHOICE. I felt the room spin for a second, my heart pounding in my ears. Choice? What choice had we made that had brought us here? Was it when we used the Ouija board? When we asked about the dark web? Or was it something more subtle? Something we couldn't even remember? David's face twisted in confusion and fear. "What choice? What do you mean?" The planchette moved again, faster this time, as if it was eager to deliver its answer. SACRIFICE. My stomach dropped. Sacrifice? I pulled my hands away from the board, unable to touch it any longer. The word hung in the air like a dark cloud, suffocating us with its weight. I couldn't breathe. David leaned forward, his hands trembling, but still on the planchette. No, we're not sacrificing anyone. There has to be another way. But the board didn't stop. The planchette moved without his input, spelling out a new message that made my skin crawl. ONEORALL. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. One or all. That was the choice it was giving us. Either one of us had to be sacrificed, or it would take all of us. Joe and Kelly, they hadn't disappeared. They'd been taken. David's face went slack with horror. We can't choose. I stood up, backing away from the table, my heart racing. We're not playing this game. We're not sacrificing anyone. We have to figure something else out. David shook his head, tears welling in his eyes. But what if we can't? What if it's too late? We sat in silence, the weight of the decision crushing down on us. There was no right answer. We couldn't choose one of us to be sacrificed. But if we didn't, we knew we were all going to end up like Joe and Kelly. Gone. Erased from existence. Then, the lights in the apartment flickered. The shadows in the room seemed to grow darker, deeper, as if they were coming alive. I felt it. Something was in the room with us now, watching, waiting. David stood, his face pale but determined. If it's a choice between all of us dying, or just one, I'll do it. I'll be the one. I grabbed his arm, shaking my head frantically. Number, you don't have to do this. We'll figure something out. Before I could finish, my phone buzzed. Another message. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I pulled my phone from my pocket, my hands shaking so badly I could barely read the screen. The choice has been made. I looked up at David, but he was already gone. 1 second, he had been standing there, right in front of me, and the next, he had vanished. The air where he'd been was cold. The shadows where he'd stood were darker. I screamed his name, but there was no answer. I was alone. For hours, I sat there, waiting, hoping that David would somehow come back. But deep down, I knew he wouldn't. The sacrifice had been made. It had taken him, just like it had taken Joe and Kelly. The next morning, my phone finally connected to the internet. The blank pages were gone. The strange messages had stopped. It was as if none of it had ever happened. But I knew better. I threw away the Ouija board, deleted every app, changed my phone, my number, everything. But I can still feel it, lingering just at the edge of my life. The presence, the weight of it, the knowledge that it's still watching. Because the truth is, you can't undo a choice like that. You can't escape it. And now, I'll always wonder, when will it come for me too?